Tommy Andrews was just an ordinary 11-year-old boy, quiet, reserved, and always lost in the world of his comic books. Tommy never sought attention. In the small town of Clifton Pines, where everybody knew everyone, Tommy's solitude was chalked up to him being shy. His parents, Carol and David, loved him dearly but often found themselves busy with their work and social obligations. Tommy didn't mind being alone, he preferred it that way. At least, he did until he began to suspect there was something under his bed. It started on a cool September evening. The air outside was crisp, a stark contrast to the warmth of the inside of Tommy's room. He had just finished reading the latest issue of Adventure Hero, his favorite comic series. Sleepy-eyed, Tommy placed the comic on his nightstand, turned off his lamp, and curled up under his blanket. As he drifted off, something strange happened. He heard a sound. At first, it was faint, like scratching or the whisper of fabric against wood. Tommy held his breath, his heart thudding in his chest as he listened. Maybe it was the house settling, or maybe it was the wind outside rustling the trees. But as the minutes ticked by, the noise grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like something dragging its nails along the floorboards beneath his bed. Tommy sat up, every hair on his body standing on end. He glanced around the darkened room, his eyes adjusting to the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sound persisted. He could feel his pulse pounding in his throat as he carefully swung his legs over the side of the bed. His toes brushed the floor, and that's when he heard it, something breathing. Frozen in fear, Tommy slowly retracted his feet, pulling them back under the covers. The breathing wasn't his. It was low, guttural, and it came from beneath his bed. The rest of the night, Tommy lay still, too terrified to move. He barely slept, his mind racing with the possibilities of what could be under there. Monsters weren't real, were they? His parents always said there was no such thing as creatures in the dark, but now, Tommy wasn't so sure. Morning came, and with it, the sun's golden rays that bathed the room in warmth. Tommy was groggy, his body sore from staying tense all night. His mother knocked on his door, calling him down for breakfast. He thought about telling her, explaining what he'd heard, but he didn't want to sound like a scared little kid. He was 11, almost 12. He should be able to handle a little creaking, right? The day passed uneventfully. Tommy went to school, hung out with his best friend Greg, and by the time evening rolled around, the events of the previous night seemed like a distant memory. He convinced himself that it had all been a bad dream, just his imagination running wild. But when night fell again, so did the silence, and the scratching. Tommy lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the familiar sound returned. It was as if something was waiting for the darkness to settle in before making its presence known. His stomach churned with dread. What was under his bed? Did it only come out at night? Could it hurt him? The next few nights followed the same terrifying pattern. Tommy would hear the scratching, the breathing, and the occasional shifting beneath his bed, and each morning, he would find nothing. He started losing sleep, his grades at school began to drop, and even Greg noticed something was wrong. Tommy's face grew pale, his eyes sunken, and he became jumpier than ever. One day, after school, Greg asked, "Dude, what's going on? You look like you haven't slept in weeks." Tommy hesitated. He wanted to tell someone, but he wasn't sure Greg would believe him. After all, it sounded ridiculous, a monster under the bed? That was the kind of stuff little kids believed in, not middle schoolers. "I think." Tommy started, then stopped. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "I think there's something under my bed." Greg's face twisted in confusion. "What do you mean? Like, a rat or something?" Tommy shook his head. "No. I don't know what it is, but it scratches and breathes at night. I hear it moving." Greg looked skeptical but didn't laugh. "Have you told your parents?" Tommy shook his head again. "They wouldn't believe me. I need to figure out what it is. I'm scared, Greg." Greg nodded. his expression serious. "All right, I'll come over tonight, we'll check it out together." That evening, Greg came over for a sleepover. They spent most of the night playing video games and talking about school. But as midnight approached, the room fell silent. The house was dark, the kind of darkness that wraps around you like a thick blanket. Greg lay on a sleeping bag on the floor while Tommy nervously lay on his bed, waiting. The scratching started. Greg's eyes widened, and Tommy saw the realization wash over his friend's face. This wasn't a joke. "Do you hear that?" Tommy whispered. Greg nodded, his voice barely audible. "Yeah." The scratching grew louder, followed by that same eerie breathing. It was unmistakable. Something was under the bed. Summoning all the courage he could, Tommy grabbed a flashlight from his nightstand and motioned for Greg to follow. They both knelt on the floor, their hearts hammering as Tommy flicked on the light. Slowly, he lowered the beam of light onto the bed, inching it closer to the darkness beneath. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating dust bunnies and old toys. But then, something else appeared. A pair of gleaming, yellow eyes stared back at them. Both boys recoiled in horror, scrambling backward. Whatever was under there blinked, and a low growl rumbled from beneath the bed. The creature, whatever it was, shifted, and they could see its long, bony fingers curling around the edge of the bed frame, nails digging into the wood. Tommy's blood ran cold. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. This was real. There was a thing under his bed, and it was watching them. Greg whispered, "What do we do?" Tommy didn't know. His mind was blank with terror. The thing under the bed shifted again, and they heard a wet, slithering sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. It was coming out. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. Both boys jumped, and whatever was under the bed retreated into the shadows, its eyes vanishing from sight. They heard footsteps, and moments later, Tommy's father burst into the room, looking confused and concerned. "Are you boys okay?" David asked, his eyes scanning the room. Tommy tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. His father shook his head, muttering something about kids and overactive imaginations, and left the room. Tommy and Greg stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. By morning, Greg went home, shaken but supportive of Tommy. They both agreed that they needed to figure out what was happening. Greg suggested they set up a camera to catch whatever was lurking beneath the bed, and Tommy reluctantly agreed. That night, after setting up his phone to record, Tommy lay in bed, waiting. He kept his flashlight clutched in his hand, his body tense with anticipation. The scratching started, as it always did, but this time, Tommy was ready. He didn't check under the bed. He didn't move. He just waited until morning. When the sun rose, Tommy grabbed his phone and played the recording. At first, it was nothing, just hours of darkness and the sound of his own breathing. But then, around 3 a.m., the camera picked up something. A shadow moved in the corner of the frame, just barely visible. The scratching grew louder, and slowly, from under the bed, a long, thin arm reached out, fingers twitching. The creature's head followed, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. But then, something else happened, something Tommy hadn't expected. The creature wasn't coming from under the bed. It was him. Tommy watched in horror as the camera showed his own body twisting and contorting, his limbs elongating and his skin stretching unnaturally. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of agony as his hands clawed at the floor, and then, his body slithered under the bed, leaving behind only a shadow of what he once was. The truth hit Tommy like a freight train. He was the thing under the bed. Every night, he transformed into the monster he feared, only to forget by morning. The memories, the fear, it was all him, trapped in an endless loop of terror and denial. Tommy dropped the phone, his mind unraveling as the realization sank in. He wasn't being haunted by a creature, he was the creature. And as night fell again, he felt it. The pull of the darkness, the irresistible urge to crawl beneath the bed. And so, The cycle began anew. Tommy Andrews, the boy who once feared the thing under his bed, had become the very monster he dreaded, and there was no escaping the truth anymore.